I don't need to give an introduction to John Patrick except to say I remember the first day that somebody sent me a tape. I was traveling somewhere with Jody, and we put the tape in, The Myth of Moral Neutrality, in the car. It was a long trip. Before the time we got there, I'd listened to it 4 times and still hadn't comprehended all of it. The greatest challenge I have on Christian Doctor's Digest is interviewing John Patrick. Everybody else is simple. I'm trying to keep up with him. He can pack more in one sentence than anybody I know. In fact, I had a personal experience of that. We had invited him to Bristol, and he was giving a grand rounds at our local hospital. We had finished at the restaurant, we were walking over to the hospital. He put his arm around my shoulder in a very fatherly manner to give me some good, encouragement and advice, and said to me, "Dave, it's a shame with a good mind like yours that you didn't have the benefit of a classical education like me." And on that note, I introduce to you John Patrick.
There was a fair stretch of imagination there. I want to start with prayer. Almighty God, give us a deep curiosity about all of your creation. Move us to search and to question. Give us insight and understanding. A retentive memory and the patience to ponder and reflect. May we not stop short with knowledge, but proceed to the understanding of the heart. The wisdom to view the world with the eyes of faith. Point out the beginning, direct the progress, help the completion, through Christ our Lord. Amen. That describes what I try to do. Of course, I don't succeed. But the next thing I want to do is I want to read a psalm to you. It's Psalm 53. Only 6 verses. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt and have done abominable iniquity. There is none who does good. God looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek God. Every one of them has turned aside. They have become together corrupt. There is none who does good, no, not one. Have the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call upon God? There they are in great fear, where no fear was, for God has scattered the bones of him who encamps against you. You have put them to shame, because God has despised them. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. When God brings back the captivity of his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. The first half of the psalm is not a bad description of what many professors do. Some of them take malicious pleasure in destroying the faith of innocents, for whom Jesus said it would be better if they had a millstone about their neck than that they should do those things. If I was to be half as aggressive about my faith as the Darwinians are about theirs in the university, I would be up in front of the Senate and disciplined and probably fired. We are a very biased world indeed. Now, what I want to talk to you about tonight is one area of life where I was led astray by the ethos of the university. My very first tutorial in psychiatry as a student was with a very bright atheistic Jew who said, "We will discuss the proposition that all feelings of sin are evidence of depression." That is the kind of ethos within which I was educated. Clever, cynical, sarcastic, and destructive. I love coming to the States. You're so kind and generous and warm. Most of our trips to Africa have been, in the last few years, at least in part, funded by you, for which we are deeply grateful. God has given this nation great energy. I sometimes wish it could be directed rather more precisely. Six years ago, when David called me and accused me of making a tape called The Myth of Moral Neutrality, I denied it. I didn't know I had made a tape, and I don't to this day know who it was who recorded it, and I don't remember giving the talk. but it has changed my life. And what I want to talk to you about tonight is yet another episode in this process of trying to look at the things within the context of medicine where the liberal elite who rule us have dominated the field of play, and they have no right to do so. The myth of moral neutrality was the first thing that took me in that direction. Tonight I want to talk about abortion. How many of you, this is asking you to be very honest, but how many of you are like me who called yourself Christian at various points and yet had no strong aversion to abortion? A good proportion of us, we, the ones who go by the byways, yes. I was more than ambivalent. I was actually in favor. Largely because I was doing infectious diseases in the 60s before abortion was legal, and seeing women with rubella. And they would come and say, I think I'm pregnant and I've got this rash, is it German measles? And I would say, it looks like it. We'll take some blood today and some more in 10 days, and then we'll decide what to do. And 10 days later, I would tell them what the odds were, anything from 0 to 90% of having a child with major neurological or cardiac problems. And then I would say, well, this pregnancy's gone wrong. You should start again. And they would be put on the list as a D&C. It was strictly illegal by British law at the time. I suppose we did it every 6 weeks or so. And then Vaughan, who had waited 10 years for a case, had a 12 or 13-year-old girl who was raped by a guardsman, and she became pregnant, and he did the abortion and then went to the police and told them what he'd done so that he would become a trial case. And abortion in Britain was legalized because no jury would convict a doctor for doing that to a 12 or 13-year-old who'd been raped. And so abortion was legalized by case law. Neither Vaughan nor anyone else at that time saw 52 million abortions a year as the outcome of that first move. This was before Roe v Wade. I certainly didn't. Some were aware that this was deeply wrong. Christians. The man who delivered our first 2 children, Peter Firth, never had a permanent position as an academic obstetrician, which he should have had, because he would not do abortions. And in the British NHS, if someone was appointed to the hospital staff who didn't do them, that meant other people had to do more. Nobody enjoys doing them. But even when he didn't get a permanent job, it didn't really get to me. It's been a long, slow journey for me. I was the classic reductionist, interested in the science and living the common life of a Christian doctor, what I call the schizophrenic Christian doctor. What you do on Sunday and what you do during the rest of the week are not in fact coherent with one another. When I travel the country, the question that I get asked all the while by students is, where do we find Christian mentors? And in Canada, I take out the CMDS book and I say, well, these are the guys in your town who say they're Christian. What do you think the response is? The students say, him, a Christian? I would never have known. And I was in exactly the same state. If I had been pulled up on a charge of being a Christian in hospital for at least 20 years, there wouldn't have been enough evidence to convict. I never denied that God was God, that Jesus was the Son of God, that he died for my sins. But I didn't want him in charge of my life. I was honest about what I believed to be true, but not willing to accept the implications. That, despite listening to Martin Lloyd-Jones for 5 years, and taking in those sermons, many of which I could relay to you now in fairly accurate outline, years and years later. He got to my head, not my heart. There's a line in Gray's Elegy, let not ambition mock their youthful toil, their homely joys. It did, and it has in our life because of what I did and the way I lived. It took students to bring me back. First in Jamaica, where I saw students coming from good Christian homes to the university, and arriving in Kingston, they would have a 20-minute ride in the taxi to the university. They came from good Christian homes, mainly evangelical, fairly fundamentalist. And on their journey from the airport to the university, on the left-hand side, there's a gully with shacks along it with 20 people to the room. And on the right-hand side, there's Long Mountain, with beautiful houses, the foundations of which cost $100,000. By the time they got to the university, they were appalled. I mean, if you're not an idealist at 18, you'll be a fascist by 40. And of course, the church had no policy on poverty. Nobody ever preached a sermon on what God thinks about poverty, why he allows it, or whether he allows it, or whether we do. None of those things. But the Marxists had ideas. And this was the 70s. Well, I'd been very left-wing myself as a student. But I'd reached the stage of realizing what the problem is. You see, Marxism is a post-Christian heresy. There would be nothing wrong with Marxism if we were good. Anybody here perfect? Stand up. So even here, there's nobody capable of being a Marxist. By the way, global capitalism, exactly the same heresy. There would be nothing wrong with market capitalism if we were good. But we're not. And just as Marxism destroyed Russia, global capitalism could destroy us. Because what happens to your giving as your income increases, statistically? Do you know? It goes down, that's right. As our income rises, the percentage we give away diminishes. Not the absolute amount, obviously, but the percentage. I'm challenged every year by the fact that our oldest daughter and her husband probably give away percentage-wise. Not probably, they do. They give away more than we do, despite our best efforts. We rationalize our self-indulgence so easily, don't we? That's the way I went. The schizophrenic physician who rationalized his own desires until those students got to me, and I would sit down and tell them, look, this is what's wrong. And they, bless them, took it more seriously than I did. Some of them are good friends to this day. They challenged me in that sense, but I didn't give in at that point. It took a long while. But there isn't time to go into that story now. I want you to start thinking about the ways in which we can talk about abortion with more confidence than we do. I read that psalm because it says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. We don't actually believe that, do we? Because we're not prepared to stand up and say, it's foolish to believe there is no God. When did you last say that? Raise that. Raise your hand if you've said that to a colleague in the recent past. I see one hand go up. Two. You're a fool not to believe in God. Not someone lacking faith, a fool, says the psalmist. In other words, that psalm implies that we ought to be able to show rationally that abortion is not a good choice. That doing what God says is wrong is not a good choice. We ought not to be afraid of that. It ought to be a challenge that we take on. And we need to do that. The university world has lost its way. When you send your children to university now, you don't send them to a university anymore. You send them to a multiversity. It used to be called a university because it had a unitary idea of what truth was. All truth was God's truth. And last night you heard Francis Collins argue for all truth being available to us. There are some caveats that need to be applied to that, but there isn't time to go into those tonight. The things that are known belong to us and our children. The things that are unknown belong to God. There needs to be a little more awe in the system than there currently is. Not everything that can be done should be done. There are deeper issues. But not in our world, because Francis Collins and myself and people like me are educated into a system of thought in which what's happening to us is never discussed. Here are 5 categories of change in thought that happen in the university without anyone discussing it. But one idea is substituted for another without anyone saying anything. Here's my list. In the university now, they talk about rights and laws, substituting that for rights and wrongs. In the university, they play on individual freedom under the title of choice, substituting that for the idea of common good. They talk about power, substituting that for the idea of justice. They talk about secularism to replace religious understanding, not ever acknowledging that secularism is a religion. They are elitist. We are popularist. When de Tocqueville came to the States to try and understand why the American Revolution worked and the French one didn't, he said he didn't understand why until he went into the churches of America. Chesterton, many years later, said, America is a country with the soul of a church. That used to be true. It's not as true as it used to be. It's getting thinner. One of the things that really worries me is that your churches are taking on the characteristics of a social club. Church is a place where you don't say anything to offend anyone. When did you last hear a real good, rip-roaring argument about the truth of something in church? That ought to happen frequently. You ought to go to church and be made to feel very uncomfortable. That's the preacher's job, to tell you the truth about yourself. And the truth about ourselves is never good news, is it? My wife sometimes refers to these talks as my strange ideas. So you can decide whether these are strange or... They're certainly strange in the sense that they're not talked about as much as they used to be. And they need to be. No, we need a lot more truth-telling. And we need to learn to tell it in the appropriate way. That means starting with a question, and as my good friend Graham Hunter puts it, using a boxing metaphor, counter-punching with an argument. Never lead with the argument. Always lead with the question. And about 18 months ago, I think it was, at Wayne State, I've forgotten the name of the young man who asked me to go there, who lives in a not salubrious part of Detroit in order to do this work. So there's somebody here who knows who his name is. I'm sure one of the students is here. But he asked me to go, and he said, would you talk about Roe v. Wade, since you're going to be there on the 30 years anniversary of Roe v. Wade? And I took a deep breath and said, yes, I ought to be willing to do that. And I started saying my prayers. Because I had not taken on abortion in a midday lecture in a medical school before. And as I began to think and read about it, I realized that there's no good reason why I shouldn't. I ought to win this hands down. And this is how I do it, and I want you to go away and think about it. I say to students, and there will be a good number of ordinary medical students, we are so unbiased in our selection of medical students that I suspect that about 75% of them are pro-choice. You can think about whether that's appropriate when we're teaching patient-centered medicine, and medicine is primarily a moral activity, therefore you ought to be able to find a doctor who shares your understanding of morality. In other words, we are in need of affirmative action. Isn't that interesting? There isn't a single pro-life medical school in North America. I used to say Loma Linda was, but I was there 2 or 3 weeks ago and I discovered it wasn't. There isn't one. It's time, isn't it? It's time. So I say to the students, is there any possibility of agreement on the issue of abortion? And what's the immediate answer? No. If we talk about it, it'll end up as a shouting match, won't it? Yes. So since we're after civil conversation, we won't start there. But let me ask you a second question. By and large, do you consider that the doctors you work with, except perhaps 10 or 20% of them who shouldn't be in medicine at all, and you know who I mean, but the rest of them, do you think that they practice, by and large, ethical medicine? What's the answer this time? The answer is yes. So, our real question is not abortion. See, you have one group in the medical school and in the practice of medicine who practice ethical medicine and think that good ethics includes the right to abortion. And you have another group who practice good ethical medicine and think that it includes the right to say that abortion is wrong. So the real question we need to address is, what would it be necessary to believe to make abortion rational and ethical? Now, as Christians, you might think that's impossible, but it isn't. This is what we need to think through much more carefully. You see, ethics are a result of what we say we believe. Now, in Canada, it's actually very easy to unpack this particular argument, because the man who is the leader of the abortion movement is a man called Henry Morgentaler. He's a Jew who lost all his family except for one brother in Auschwitz. That brother actually kept him alive, and amazingly, that brother is still a believing Jew, and sometimes wishes he hadn't kept his brother alive. Henry, you see, after that experience, ceased to believe in God. I don't know about you, but I can understand that. I'm not sure that I would believe in God if I'd lost all my family in Auschwitz. It would certainly require a great outpouring of grace into my soul for that to happen. But God is capable of that, obviously. He's done it with many people. But not with Henry. Henry became an existentialist. And that makes abortion ethical. Because you see, the existentialist, like Henry, says, when I'm dead, you can put me in the nearest garbage pail. But he still inhabits the Jewish story of compassion for those who are suffering. Now, hopefully there's no one here who doesn't recognize that a woman with an unwanted and unexpected pregnancy is suffering, isn't she? And she faces three ways of losing. If she has an abortion, she'll never forget the date. If she gives the child up for adoption, she'll spend the rest of her life wondering what it's doing and feeling disloyal. If she keeps it, she's likely to be economically marginalized. And the child growing up probably without a father will suffer the undoubted effects of being fatherless, of which we're going to see many in the next few years. As you all know now, it's a father who is the most important character to make sure that boys do not become criminal. The absence of a father in a family is one of the most clear indicators of higher risk for criminality. So that's what she faces. Now, for Henry, the cleanest solution is an abortion. Get rid of the baby and get on with your life. You'll get over the feelings. What he sees, you see, is two eternally insignificant lives. They're absurd. Life has no meaning. Let me read to you. Here's Bertrand Russell's definition of what it's like to be that sort of a person. You are to believe this, that man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes, his fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of the accidental collocation of atoms. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Sartre. God does not exist, and we have to face all the consequences of this. The existentialist is strongly opposed to a certain kind of secular ethics which would like to abolish God with the least possible expense. The existentialist, on the contrary, thinks it very distressing that God does not exist, because all possibility of finding values in a heaven of ideas disappears with him. There can be no a priori good, since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it. Nowhere is it written that the good exists, that we must be honest, that we must not lie, because the fact is that we are in a world where there are only men. Dostoevsky said, if God doesn't exist, everything would be permissible. That is the very starting point of existentialism. And as a result, man is forlorn, because neither within him nor without does he find anything to cling to. If God does not exist, we find no values or commands to turn to which legitimize our conduct. That's the tacit position of many of my colleagues in the University of Henry Morgentaler. So he's not dishonest. He says, what I do is snuff out human life. Two absurd human lives is what he sees when he sees a woman who wants an abortion. One self-conscious and the other unself-conscious. He's modern. He thinks in terms of rights and laws, not rights and wrongs. So when he has snuffed out the absurd, unself-conscious life, what has happened to the net happiness in the world? It's increased. If, and only if, life is absurd. Now put Mother Teresa by the bed. What does she see? She sees two eternally significant lives, one of whom is about to put her soul in jeopardy. What's the right thing to do now? What's the ethical thing to do now? The exact opposite. You see, it's not that one group, the pro-choice people, are rational, intelligent people, and the other, the pro-life people, are bigoted fundamentalists. No. There are two rationalities at work here. Our medical school doesn't have a moral consensus. Our nations in the Western world no longer have a moral consensus. We are not truly nations anymore. We're collections of people who live in the same country. And nationalism will not solve that problem. It's a major difficulty that the Western world faces. It's one that the Muslim world looks upon with scorn because they do have a moral consensus within their world, an enforced one and a diminished one in many ways, I think. Otherwise I'd be a Muslim. But that's where we're at the moment. In fact, the pro-choice people are more bigoted than the pro-life. Because bigotry is the refusal to take seriously the alternative to your own proposition. Pro-lifers are forced to take the pro-choice position seriously because they have the political power. They never engage our arguments if they can avoid it. Now, by this time, in a lecture in the secular medical school, did you know what? It's gone strangely quiet. Because they can't undo that argument. And I'm only a third of the way through it, and they're now convicted as bigots. And they're also beginning to realize that this is a bigger issue than they realized. I often say much more than a baby dies in abortion. That's what I didn't understand. And of course, it was a very anti-democratic move. That's something else that Christians ought to know. You ought to have it in your pocketbook. These are the facts of the politics of the USA preceding Roe v. Wade. The most important case was actually Griswold versus the state of Connecticut on the right to privacy over contraception. I haven't got time to go into that at the moment. But that preceded Roe v. Wade. Even before that, Guttmacher, who was with Planned Parenthood, said this. He said that any law challenging the life of the unborn would be voted down. He thought that there was no way that such a law could go through. And in fact, the politicians who actually know what people believe, this is what they did. 1967, therapeutic abortion was defeated as a proposition in Arizona, Georgia, New York, Indiana, North Dakota, New Mexico, Nebraska, and New Jersey. 1969, defeated in Iowa, Minnesota, Nevada, and Illinois. 70 in Vermont and Massachusetts. 71 in Montana and New Mexico again, Iowa again. You see, they keep coming till they get what they want. There's no let-up. Eternal vigilance is required. In Minnesota, in Maryland, in Colorado, in Massachusetts, in Georgia, in Connecticut, in Illinois, in Maine, Ohio, and North Dakota. In 72, Massachusetts, while Blackmun was writing the Roe v. Wade decision, Massachusetts voted 178 to 46 for full legal rights for the unborn. How many of you knew those facts? That's amazing. How can you make the case if you don't know the data? In 1973, 61% of Michigan voters and 76% of North Dakota voters voted against abortion. And yet, Blackmun and Ginsburg argued that they were just responding to a democratic need. They knew that that was not true. That was an outright lie. And they knew it. But they went ahead and did it because they belong to the ruling elite. Our court in Canada is even worse than yours, but yours is bad. As Scalia says, he sits on a court watching laws being made for a country which he increasingly does not recognize. Scalia and Thomas have been the only reliable ones who understand this issue. Anthony Kennedy, amazingly at long last, joined them over the partial birth abortion case. In the Casey case, some years later, the court actually acknowledged that the Roe v. Wade decision may have been wrong. Do you know what they said? You have to accept it because the court said so. That's what George Will means when he talks about your robed masters. I thought it was the will of the people. But no, it's the will of the Supreme Court now. That's why First Things had its issue on the judicial usurpation of democracy a year or two ago. But these things can be reversed. And the evidence is that it's happening. And the US is leading the way. I hope you noticed that in the last election, Gore did not go after Bush very much on abortion. You know why? Because the spin doctors told him, you don't win on this deal. The American population is now more than 50% opposed to abortion. That's the first nation in the Western world to move back that far. If we deepen the argument, we might take it further. Nothing like that happening in Europe yet, but hopefully it will come in due course, because the truth of what is at stake is huge. You see, the problem with your court and ours is that the judges think that they make the law. In the past, the classical understanding of the function of the judge was to discover the law. There's a big difference between making the law and discovering it. I often read this passage that I'm going to read now. Many of you have heard me talk before, have heard me read it before. But since you haven't learnt it yet, I'll read it again. I could paraphrase it, but it's so beautifully written that I should read it properly. And in fact, you should have this in your pocketbook to give to people. Because here's one of the key moves in the modern university setting. The man who wrote this was an unbelieving Jew. Always look for an atheist to make your point for you. It takes the reflex anti-Christian comments away. This is what he wrote in a famous article, Unspeakable Ethics, Unnatural Law, published in the Duke Law Review, 1979, over 20 years ago. Easy to find because the volume and the year is the same in the Duke Law Review. It's a beautiful piece. But this is how it opens. He says, I want to believe, and so do you, in a complete, transcendent and immanent set of propositions about right and wrong. Findable rules that authoritatively and unambiguously direct us as to how to live our lives righteously. I also want to believe, after all, he's a professor at Yale in the 70s, in no such thing. But rather that we are wholly free not only to choose for ourselves what we ought to do, but to decide for ourselves individually and as a species what we ought to be. What we want, heaven help us, is to be simultaneously perfectly ruled and perfectly free. That is, at the same time, to discover the right and the good and to create it. Now, even with the advanced state of intellectual decay in our universities, people recognize you can't have both of them. You have got to choose. And Leff then does something that academics don't usually do. He writes 20 pages of lucid prose, weighing the pros and cons of that argument. He does it honestly. He does it well, until he comes to the conclusion. It's a bit before political correctness, but the pressures were already on. And he wrote, all I can say is this. It looks to me as if we are all that we have. Given what we know about ourselves and about each other, this is an extraordinarily unappetizing prospect. Looking around the world, it appears that if all men are brothers, the ruling model is Cain and Abel. Now in your medical schools, I have to explain who Cain and Abel were because many Americans no longer know. After all, it's over a generation since the Bible was taken out of high school. Can you imagine a Muslim society that would take the Quran out of school? It's the most crazy experiment the world has ever done. Even Britain didn't do that. And let's face it, only the grace of God keeps that place from being totally pagan, although Peter said to me he thinks it is. It's amazing what is happening in the Western world. No, it's horrendous what's happening. No biblical knowledge, and therefore no understanding of our own language. No understanding of our own culture. And therefore, when we lose our history, we're bound to go wrong. Revisionist history is being taught in American schools, and most parents don't understand it. Your history is very badly taught. Michael Novak has just written a very nice book called On Two Wings. Has anyone read it? I always live in hope. No? You should. It's not a long book. Michael Novak noticed that the textbooks were badly out of line. Then he realized what to do. He went and got the names of everyone who signed the Declaration of Independence, or whatever you want to call it, and those who signed the Constitution. And then he set about discovering what they believed. Does it surprise you to learn that Jefferson and Madison were way out in left field, and those are the only two whose ideas are really talked about in your school textbooks? And even Madison stayed on at Princeton for an extra year. Do you know why? To do another course in theology with Witherspoon. Even Ben Franklin said at the beginning of the meetings that led to the Declaration of Independence, we'd better start with prayer. After all, he was a good friend of Whitefield. But what Novak does is show you what the people who led to the founding of America believed, and how far your court is from the people who were your founders, whom you say you honor. History is important. How many of you read McCullough's John Adams? I know there's at least one here who's read it. 2 or 3, 4, more of those. It's a good book, isn't it? What Novak does is what McCullough didn't understand, and that was how deeply Christian Adams was. He doesn't really understand it, especially he doesn't understand Abigail. We need to know these stories and tell them to our children. You in particular. We have other stories we need to tell, but they're the same line. I mean, in Canada we have a young feminist professor who recently got a prize for writing about the Widows' Mite societies in the Maritimes. She had no idea what the Widows' Mite was. She thought it was a women's organisation for self-help. We didn't disabuse her. We left her to make a fool of herself in due course, you know. Self-help gets us nowhere. We need help from on high, don't we? Left goes on. Neither reason, nor love, nor even terror, a reference to the KGB, seems to have worked to make us good. And worse than that, there is no reason why anything should. Only if ethics were something unspeakable by us could law be unnatural and therefore unchallengeable. As things stand now, everything is up for grabs. But he's Jewish too. He couldn't handle that. So he wrote 2 more sentences, which are total non sequiturs. Nevertheless, he says, napalming babies is bad, starving the poor is wicked, buying and selling each other is depraved. There is in this world such a thing as evil. He just said there wasn't. He knew what he should do. If you have a technically correct argument and you arrive at a conclusion which is clearly wrong, what must you do? Re-examine the premise. He should have gone back to the beginning of that penultimate paragraph and rewritten it, and it should read, it looks to me, thank God, as though we are not all that we have. Because if we are all that we have, then abortion is legal and justice is a figment of the imagination. And the university is right to say it's power that matters. If your children take a course in women's studies or black studies or queer studies, they will be told that it's power that matters. And that's why they use the courts and not arguments. And we're nowhere there, are we? We don't even pick up and run with the obvious cases that could send shudders through the educational establishment. As far as I know, there's never been a class action suit on the effects of human papillomavirus, the cause of most cancer of the cervix in North America. Now, for 10 years, I've been asking a 4th-year science honours class, tell me the 2 sexually transmitted diseases that are not in any way protected against by a condom, and never yet have I had a correct answer. They don't know. In other words, the sex educators are doing a horrendously bad job. If you as physicians proposed a treatment for any of your patients that might help them, but carried the risk of cancer or future risks to pregnancies for the children, and you didn't tell them, What chance would you have in court? Absolutely none. Why have not the women who've had cancer of the cervix got together and had a class action suit? It would send shudders through the educational establishment. It would probably close sex education down overnight. It'd be a catastrophe for them. What have you done? As far as I know, nothing. I hear rumours that it might be going to happen every now and again, but nothing seems to happen. Why not? I don't know. So abortion is only ethical if life is absurd. But if life is absurd, then the law is an invention, not a discovery. Now what happens then? Well, Lewis described this a long while ago, in the 1940s. This is what he wrote. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem of human life was how to conform the soul to objective reality. That's God. And the solution was wisdom, self-discipline, and virtue. For the modern mind, the cardinal problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men, and the solution is technique. The pursuit of happiness in the modern sense is therefore self-indulgent. Man's conquest of nature must always be some man's conquest of nature, using other men as the means. But these powerful people, our justices for example, no longer think of God and God's laws as objective reality. So what are they ruled by? If there is no God to rule them, what's left? So, says Lewis, they are controlled not by God's supernatural ideals, but by the natural forces of their own heredity and environment. Thus, man's conquest of nature turns out to be nature's conquest of man. And what disappears this time? Our humanity. Aldous Huxley saw this coming when he wrote Brave New World. He feared that we would become a nation that did not care about the truth. And then we would become totalitarian. Orwell feared that we would be denied access to the truth by the government. That was the Russian proposition, and it failed. But I'm afraid that Huxley's vision is coming true in the Western world. I saw, was it in USA Today or one of those? No, it was a Canadian newspaper, because it's the first stuff coming out from the Canadian statistics, that Canadian parents are spending 4 minutes a day reading to their children, on average. And how many hours a week of watching television? That's Orwell's Soma. You watch television. Even Christians watch Seinfeld. That's beyond belief. Here you've got postmodern, nihilistic, navel-gazing, sick humour. And you watch it. And it gets to your soul. So that you lose the capacity to see what's actually happening to you. It's horrendous. We have got to do something about this. Because the Muslim complaint that we are becoming immoral should actually be that we are becoming amoral. They have a case, don't they? When I started in medical school, you could get through finals if you were sufficiently cynical with knowledge of 3 sexually transmitted diseases. I think at last count it was over 35, and probably the infectious diseases guys will tell me it's even more now. That, nobody can call that progress, can they? You see, when you start to destroy what God has given, things fall apart. The beginning of a wedge that's breaking all sorts of things down. See, in order to rationalize abortion, what had to be done, and what the feminists did very quickly, was to change the definition of personhood. Let me just read to you, actually from this current issue of First Things. There's a beautiful article by Jay Bachevsky called The Second Tablet Project. And he quotes one of the feminist writers. I didn't mark it, of course, and I will regret that. Talking about what was necessary in order to legitimize abortion. And I can't find it at the moment, but it doesn't matter. The point being that you had to talk about persons in terms of functions, not in terms of intrinsic rights. See, we used to believe that abortion was wrong because every living human creature was made in the image of God. It had intrinsic reasons for respect and honor and protection. But after Roe v. Wade, you had to justify your existence, because now you are a choice, right? Any child born after Roe v. Wade is technically the mother's choice. She could have destroyed it. Before, she couldn't. Now, the definitions, this feminist says, well, until you're capable of relationship. Now, some women would argue that puts all men out of the range of... and so you go on. When you're asleep, do you cease to be a person? You see, and the thing is progressing. So we got to partial birth abortion a couple of years ago, and your Supreme Court said it is a woman's right to turn a baby in utero at term, deliver it as a breech. And while the hands are clasping and the legs are kicking, to shove a trocar into the back of the neck and pith it as long as the head is still in the birth canal. That's a woman's right in America and Canada. A single clinic does 1,000 a year in New Jersey. Do any of you think that's a woman's right? Any woman who's done it has destroyed herself, hasn't she? If she ever thinks about what she has been an accomplice to. So, you see, your self-respect and your self-understanding is another casualty of the abortion process, because there was no logical place to draw the line. Now you have Peter Singer, of course, taking it the next step. He says, well, if a woman has the right, which she does, to kill a baby up to the moment of birth, surely if the baby that's born is going to be, shall we say, 2 years old developmentally for the next 20 years, that's going to be a lot more inconvenient than a 9-month pregnancy, isn't it? So, you must have some months to decide whether you want to keep the baby. And if not, infanticide must be legalized. Peter Kreeft said to me a little while back, he said, John, be careful of being lucid. He'd given a lecture in Boston. Time is gone, by the way. And afterwards, 2 women came up and said, thank you for that lecture. We were worried about infanticide. Now we see that it's necessary. And it is, if you inhabit that world. So is geriatricide. We're on the way. Oregon is leading the way. And it's going to go on in that direction. Let me just, because there isn't time, but give you a list of some of the things that are going to be logically diminished as the meaning of abortion works its way through our society. I have a list of 11 categories that are going to change. Our understanding of what happiness is changes. You see, the reason abortion is so important to these young women and to the father is that they conceive of their happiness in diminished senses. Go listen to Robert Spitzer's 4 levels of happiness if you want to understand more deeply what's at stake. But if happiness is subjective and self-referential, then abortion is clearly going to be what you want if you believe that life is absurd. But the deepest happinesses in our lives are not like that. They come from when we sacrifice ourselves to the good. So our own understanding of happiness will change. It is changing. It's dramatically changed, actually, in universities already. Our understanding of success will change. Because when women do get pregnant in medical school and decide to have the baby, some of their more militant sisters will accuse them of leaving the cause behind by not having an abortion. You see, there was a columnist in The Guardian who attacked Cherie Blair for having the baby. He says, how can she call herself a feminist having a baby at that age when the world is overpopulated? By the way, the world is not overpopulated, but that's another issue. So our understanding of what it means to be successful will change. Our assessment of our self-worth will change. The meaning of love changes. Because now it has to be a definition that doesn't involve unconditional care for those who are incapable of caring for themselves. Love used to begin with non-maleficence, never doing evil. Nobody can pretend that killing the unborn is good. The smarter feminists say it's necessary, not good. And they're now proposing, and in Japan it's highly developed, rituals to say sorry to the baby in order to deal with the guilt. It will change our understanding of suffering. Read Romans 5. It will certainly change the nature of ethics. Those who believe that we are one day going to be judged, and those who do not believe that, cannot have the same ethical system. There cannot be one ethical system for the medical school. Our argument ought to be one that's based upon the demographics of society. Argue for patient-centered medicine. And then you say, well, when we're teaching in every other area, we begin with what's common and we work towards what's rare, don't we? And we actually go after people who insist on teaching pheochromocytoma every 6 weeks. We say, look, they're not going to see those. Teach them diabetes, and they get pushed. And so they should. Yet you teach ethics as though we were all tacit atheists. Well, as far as I know, there's less than 20,000 members of the Humanist Society in North America. But 50% of the population is in church. Have the demographic data in your pocketbook. You know what it is? Roughly 90% of people, insofar as they have any means of understanding life, have Judeo-Christian ideas. They do not have Muslim ideas, they don't have Hindu ideas, they're not atheists, they're not agnostic. They're very thin Christians. I say that in Canada, where we collect this data, the StatsCan, if you draw that sample, gives you all the world's known religions, from atheism to Zoroastrianism through Satanism and nothing. And I think that what happens in Canada is they look at the list, take a deep breath, and Canadians are very good. They fill forms in. So they go down and say, I'm not a Zoroastrian, don't know what it is, not an atheist, not an agnostic, don't know what that is, not a nothing. Oh dear, I must be Christian. We are a nation of, oh dear, I must be Christian people. And then they choose Catholic or Protestant, and the ratio is reversed in Canada. We have more Catholics than Protestants. But it's very thin. It won't stand much strain in the future. Of course, it will also change the nature of freedom. You remember the key verses of Deuteronomy? It is not good that each of you should do what is right in their own eyes. God gave the law as the framework within which freedom can happen. So if you go out and drive as though you're free to drive as you wish, there won't be enough hospitals in Chicago to cope. Freedom only happens within a framework of law, so God gave the Jews a law, the best law. But that will go. Personhood is gone. Rights now become legal figments rather than intrinsic things. The courts took an intrinsic right and made it extrinsic. What the court says is now what a right is, not what can be defended from within. The common good and justice all disappear. My time is gone, and it's 10 o'clock. Those of you who wish to leave should do so. Those of you who wish to ask questions, in just a moment I'll give you a chance to do that. But time flies, doesn't it, when you're having fun? Yeah. What? Oh, it says 10 o'clock here. No, that's, you were setting me up. That's good. So, I have no idea what time it is. I just looked up and it said 10 o'clock, and I could believe it, you know. I have no idea what time it is. What are we going to do? That's the question. And what's required, of course, is a great deal more work on our part. Does it surprise you that at the end of a lecture like this, in the secular setting, I mean, I'm not quite so explicit there as I am here, there are no questions whatsoever. Just dead silence. And I say, thank you very much, and leave. And 3 weeks later, I get an email from the feminists saying, you have no right to say that partial birth abortion happens in North America. And then I send them the Supreme Court citation of the fact that it does happen. They're appalled. They haven't thought it through. They have been sucked into thinking in the ways that the university has set up. Because we have lost our capacity to argue this case. Now, one book that you could read would be Robert George's book, The Clash of Orthodoxies. Robert George teaches constitutional law at Princeton. And he does it very well. And what he does is he says, look, we can all do step one. And step one is to point out to your colleagues that you cannot prove the non-existence of God. In other words, your behavior as though there is no God is an act of faith. In fact, of course, technically it's more difficult to prove the non-existence of God than it is to prove God. Catholics maintain you can prove the existence of God. And certainly I think you can go a long way to showing that it's much more likely to be true than the alternative. Because it leads to justice, which we know we want. Because it leads to self-worth. All that list of things I gave you, those are what we all cherish, aren't they? But absent God, and they disappear. And yet we know they're real. Well, in other words, God is a much more powerful explanation for who we are than no God. And yet universities practice tacit atheism. And you have a minority group insisting that their way is right and wanting to take the Ten Commandments out of the law courts. That's not democratic. That's pure power being exercised. In fact, you see, one of our judges put it very nicely, Sapinka. He said, in this day and age, it is not appropriate that the court should behave as though a particular system of morality is the one to follow. And then later in the same judgment, he says that of necessity, there must be some system of morality, at which point it becomes the particular one. And our particular one is Christian. Judeo-Christian, to be more precise, because that's where these ideas came from. And we need to be able to stand up there and argue that case. Not from the Scriptures, to begin with, although we can get to that. But that's a longer argument. That's simply from the rational point of view. I often say to doctors, do you know that if your doctor does not believe in God, he is rationally less ethical than someone who does. Now that really causes anger. You know, the last time I said this in Alabama, a guy came up to me afterwards steaming with anger. You know, how dare you call me less ethical than Christians? I didn't say that. I said you are rationally less ethical. You see, if you do not believe in God, if you are a real Darwinian, then in the battle of genes between you and the patient, who will be most likely to give in to unethical behavior, a Darwinist or a Christian who fears for his soul? Well, if you don't believe you've got a soul, anything you give in exchange for it is a bargain. But if you do believe you have a soul, there's nothing you would give in exchange for it. How many of you have never watched the film A Man for All Seasons? An awful lot. Go watch it, because it's really about this issue. It's Thomas More and Henry VIII fighting it out on this issue. And in the middle of that, there's a scene that you could discuss with your children. Henry wants a divorce. Thomas is an incorruptible Catholic. And everybody in England knows that. So as soon as Henry wants the divorce, Thomas resigns as Chancellor of England. But Henry wants him back, because whenever rulers are doing things that are suspect, they want people with good reputations there, don't they? That's what they do. They co-opt them to use them. So Henry sends the Duke of Norfolk to persuade Thomas. And Thomas listens to him, and he resists all the arguments. In the end, Norfolk says to Thomas, "Oh, Thomas, come and be a king's man. We're friends. Join us for fellowship's sake. Be a good American, you know." And Thomas looks at him and says, "Norfolk, if I come with you now to the king's side for fellowship's sake, will you come with me later to hell for fellowship's sake?" That's the issue. What are we giving in exchange for our souls? I was guilty for many, many years of not even thinking about the implications for my soul of what I accepted every day without a word. I said nothing on the behalf of those who were incapable of speaking for themselves. Now I do. And you know what? It's not difficult. Because remember that our Lord promised this in John 16. He said, when the Holy Spirit comes, He will convict the world of sin, righteousness, and judgment. In other words, the fact that we do have souls, we all know, deep down. And the reason they don't argue with me on that issue is because they're not arguing with me, they're arguing with the Holy Spirit. And of course, every time we deny the truth of that, we become liars. And we know that too. And the more we lie, the more corrupted we become. So in the long run, we win, because God has created a morally consequential universe. But we may only win as Christians where God would wish us to win as Americans and Canadians. You remember the story of Elijah, don't you? After his great battle with the prophets of Baal, was Elijah happy? No, he was depressed. He was depressed because he thought he was alone. And God said to him, "Oh, you're not alone. There are 7,000 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal." But there was a problem, wasn't there? Elijah didn't know who they were. In other words, they never stood up. They were never counted. They were safe because God knew that they were loyal. But what happened to Israel? It was toast in very short time. And when we don't count, we are not being salt, and the nations we live in will be toast in a very short time. God never allows any nation to kill its young indefinitely. He does not like that. I mean, not very long is a few hundred years in God's time scale, but he always brings it to an end. If we don't stop killing our young, we will perish. Let us pray. Father, we need your Spirit to goad us to work at these things. Help us to see what is at issue, and help us to become willing to speak, knowing that you will give us the words we need when we need them. Give us the faith we require. Help us to do the homework that can be done, so that we may protect our nations from the ravages of sin, for Christ's sake. Amen.
Advocating the creation of specifically Christian or Hippocratic or medical training that is distinctively Christian. And if that's the case, is that not a retreat from the marketplace and the public square?
Yes. Did you all hear the question? It is a retreat in one sense, but it may be a necessary one. It's the question that MacIntyre poses at the end of After Virtue, where he says, if you followed my arguments, then you will see that I'm proposing that we've already in the Western world entered upon a second Dark Ages. But we should not be entirely without hope, because the last time this happened, good men and women withdrew from the task of shoring up the Roman Imperium into the task of forming communities within which they could keep the civilities and the virtues alive, and they succeeded. The only difference is last time the barbarians were waiting at the gate, and this time they have been ruling us for quite some time. And it is our failure to appreciate that fact that is at the heart of the matter. Now, we've already decided on quite a large scale that we will no longer trust the schools to practice social engineering on our children, right? How many of you have got your kids in either Christian or homeschooling? See, those of you can't see what I can see, but it's a good proportion. I mean, much higher than... it's about 10% in the general population, slightly over that, and growing rapidly. We just had a survey in Ontario where the mean performance in the Christian schools was on the 75th percentile of the public system. You don't need statistics to work that out. So we've got there with education now. I think we will be forced to go there with medicine because of what Francis Collins was talking about last night. And I only had a chance to talk to him very briefly, and I just asked him the one question that I really wanted to ask. I said, what about eugenics? He said, I don't know what to say. See, because you notice that he did not speak last night about prevention. It was on the list, but he never talked about it, because what does prevention mean? Well, when we get a new gene, he talked about the Philadelphia chromosome and the phosphorylation site that's gone wrong and the fancy drug that really works. Brilliant. That's one example. But what are we really doing? I mean, that's a very rare disease. Why? One of the last projects I worked on was in CF. CF is dropping like this. Why? Because of eugenic abortion. The moment we get a gene, we have a test within weeks if it is financially worthwhile. And you have insurance companies in your country who are already arguing the case that their liability for a child with an antenatal diagnosable disease ceases at the cost of an abortion. Think about that. The Christian community may well be required to put its money where its mouth is on this issue. Because the medievals, of course, recognized that the disabled were closer to God than the rest of us, because they carry no grudges into tomorrow. So these issues are coming down the line, and they will divide medicine even more than abortion has. Euthanasia and all the stuff that's involved in molecular biochemistry is beyond belief. And we will do it, because most of the people working there are not thinking about what's going on. They have no sense of awe, as I know from my own discussions in the department. So we're going to go in that direction. So we need to be prepared. I suspect that much of medicine will become what I call muffler shop medicine. When you can really define how things should be done, you don't need to go to medical school for 6 years to learn to do it. I would argue, for instance, that there is no defensible case for saying you need a surgeon to fix a hernia. Most women have better fine motor coordination than men, and they would actually fix hernias better than men, and you could train them to do it in a few weeks, and as long as you did in large groups where there was somebody on call if there was a problem, which is going to be very rare, they'll do a better job, won't they? There's no reason why it shouldn't be done that way. There will be hernia technicians, just as ECGs were originally done by physicians, now they're done by technicians. And anything that can be completely described as technique can by definition be taken over in that way. In the University of Western Ontario not long ago, just to show it could be done, they did an operation in Paris from London, Ontario, operating on coronary arteries with a robot. Because, you see, the robot doesn't mind what angle it works at. And it's so fast it can work at the same cycle of the cardiac cycle. So it operates on the coronary arteries more effectively than we can. The guys were back on his tractor, one of them from London, within 48 hours of having his coronary arteries done. Now, that's just the beginnings. I mean, hips will be replaced by robots, won't they? Because all the surgeon will be doing is putting the markers in, because, you know, my grandfather was a tool maker. He was proud of the fact that he could work to a 10,000th of an inch, but that's nothing now. The reason our cars work better is that tool makers don't make the tools anymore. They can work to a millionth of an inch now, no problem. So the modern production car is better than a Rolls-Royce of 30 years ago in many respects. The tolerances are finer. So that kind of thing is going to work its way through, and these things will be hived off in various directions. So what is medicine about? I argue that fundamentally medicine is a moral activity. It is about what people ought to do, and they need people who understand what the options are to do that. The transmission of information is what we used to do. That's nonsense, isn't it? If you send somebody to the hospital, to the internist, and they come back with a fancy diagnosis, who will know more about that diagnosis tomorrow, you or your patient? Yeah, if it's acrodermatitis enteropathica, for instance, which not more than 2 of you know what it is. But it's treatable, you see, that's why I chose it. Rare, but treatable. But they'll get on the internet and they'll know, and they'll be taking the treatment themselves. Actually, they'll cure themselves in 48 hours, because they can actually buy that at the health food store. And it's one thing that's there that really does work. That's just the tip of the iceberg. So, out of the church, and it's already started with parish nursing. I think that any church with 300 members should think about hiring a nurse. In Canada, we've started the Hippocratic Registry of Physicians, just to get people lined up to try and defend Christian medicine in due course. But there's a long argument here. Thank you for the question. It's another hour's lecture, but that's the sketching the outline.
The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that ruled Roe Vs Wade as a law of the land, was it Blackmun?
Blackmun, yes.
I read his justification or rationalization, and it sounded like he was talking in circles. It made no sense.
Yep.
So this land all these years since then has been, the law of the land has been gobbledygook.
That's right.
Oh, a better word.
This is exactly what Scalia means when he says, I sit on a court watching laws being made for a country which I increasingly do not recognize. Because the principles that were laid down are being turned on their head because the court reads into the text what they believe is there. This is postmodern reading of texts. You see, the person who wrote it doesn't have any more right to know what it means than you do, or I do. That's their position. So under those circumstances, in the history department, they will teach history as fact with no documentary evidence because they say the documents we have were written by the winners. They're biased, and we can correct the bias. You can see how the whole thing deconstructs on that basis, and that's precisely what's happening.
Has anybody ever challenged this rationalization?
Yes. If you go back to First Things a couple of years ago, there was a whole issue on the judicial usurpation of democracy dealing with this. It caused a tremendous stink, and in fact, since that article, in both the US and that issue, and in Canada, the Supreme Court justices have declined to rule on several things because of that. And if you don't know First Things, firstthings.com, put in judicial usurpation of democracy and you'll get to it. There's no reason for us not to win these things.
Would you please address and evaluate the rational argument against abortion as put forward by Robert Spitzer?
Well, it's a book. How many of you have read Healing the Culture? It's worth the effort, isn't it? It's not well written. I think he's a much better oral communicator than he is written one. But he starts with personhood. And he's basically doing what I've been talking to you about tonight is greatly influenced by Robert Spitzer. And he points out that if you misunderstand the nature of human personhood, you will get to abortion. So the discussion is much more importantly about what it means to be human and how we are to understand ourselves. And he uses as his basic framework the 4 levels of happiness. Now, how many of you here do not know that? Rather more than should be the case. Do those of you who do know, mind if I spend 5 minutes just outlining that? This is the most powerful technique that I'm aware of for opening up the gospel in a secular setting. I can use this in places like New York and get unbelieving atheistic Jews to beg me for the gospel. It's a wonderful moment. Basically, Robert Spitzer says we are misunderstanding happiness. And he says you can think of it at 4 levels. Now I simplify Robert Spitzer, and you'll probably remember my version more easily than his. Level 1 happiness for me is animal happiness. So a good example would be a meal when you've worked hard. It's a legitimate happiness and it's very enjoyable, especially if the cook is someone like Sally. Now it lasts for, it used to be 20 minutes, but when women actually civilized men, it might go on for an hour. And then it's over. And you can go on doing it throughout life. Now, every happiness except the 4th one can be abused. So, 1 in 6 university women is vomiting or starving herself to control her body weight. That's an eating disorder. That's unhappiness 1. Sexuality is the same. They think that sexuality is understood only as physical animality, only sensation. That's the homosexual problem. That's why they want anonymous sex and why they do these weird things that you see in the emergency department. They're trying to get the feeling back. Now, you can actually say this, and the amazing thing is you won't get a whimper out of them. I say, the proof that we are not just animals is precisely that. Because sex, disconjoined from committed love, becomes first boring and then perverted. And I've never had anyone come and say that's not true. Never once. Because it is true. Even within marriage, it's true. If there isn't that desire for intimacy by both sides, it can't be done properly. And that's true of, 15 or 20% of marriages. It needs to be corrected, but it's hard to do. Now, the only way out when you get to unhappiness 1 is to go to happiness 2, which I call the happiness of the mind. But we've turned it into a competition. So we used to come to university to learn, but if I describe what I think education should be, the students fall off their chairs laughing. You know, I talk about building an intellectual structure that's more and more satisfying with the passage of time, etc., etc., and they're laughing after about 3 minutes. I say, you mean that your experience of university has been memorize and dump? And the answer is yes, of course. We play Trivial Pursuit and call it university. And of course it's competitive. You're always worrying about grades. I mean, in medical school, grades are irrelevant. We don't fail anybody once they're in. So why don't we have some criteria for what a good doctor is and aim for that? But we don't. So that causes anxiety. And we have, in fact, as students now, the most anxious group of people I've ever known in my life. They're terrified about the next exam. It shouldn't be like that. So neurosis is unhappiness too. And your prescription pads for tranquilizers and antidepressants tell you how big a problem that is. Now, the only way out is to go to happiness 3. But you can see how you can understand abortion if you stick at any of these levels. And lots of people never get beyond happiness 1. And if happiness 1 is sexual activity, then pregnancy gets in the way. Get out of it. So you're going, it's rational for you. If you're competitive, it's rational for you. Get happiness 3. This is the happiness that comes about when you realize that some things are intrinsically good in and of themselves. Bringing up children is a good example. Nobody can pretend that it's pure continuous joy. You know, I watch my wife being exhausted by my grandchildren. She's saying I should stop, but that's all right. It's my granddaughter's birthday today, she's saying. It's one of them. I have 11. But they reward you. You know, they do and say wonderful things, and then you have to discipline them because although they're wonderful, they're wrong, and you have to correct them. That's happiness 3. The giving of yourself to the raising of children is deeply satisfying. Medicine can be deeply satisfying. Sometimes you get sucked into the care of a patient and you forget about billing. But if you're allowed to win against the odds, how long does that patient pay you for? The rest of your life. The payment is continuous. That's happiness 3. But you see, it's a need love. You need to be needed. It finishes with the empty nest syndrome. It finishes with retirement, with chronic disease. All sorts of ways in which it falls apart. Because God has more for us than that. Unhappiness 3 is what comes when getting your satisfactions from doing comes to an end, which it always does. Why? And this is where I have fun in the university. I say, well, I'm sorry, I can't tell you what happiness 4 is because it's politically incorrect. And of course, they're obsessive compulsives. How many of you have already, at least in your mind, written down H4, you know? There's quite a lot of you. But, of course, if it's Yale or Harvard at the East Coast, I know there are people out there who hate my guts by this stage. They know where I'm going, and there's no way they want me to go there. So I can play this game for up to about 5 minutes. And then in the end I say, well, if there's a quorum, I'll go ahead. And up go 90% of the hands, you know. And I say, well, I'm glad the rest of you are Democrats. And I've asked permission. And then, of course, I say, well, happiness 4 is knowing God. And then I start telling what I call happiness 4 stories. Diane Compt's little book, A Child's Window on Heaven, is a marvellous start, because I'll go and get the book. Not a window on heaven. You know, that opening story that brought her back to faith. You know, like me, the academic, lost her way, became an existentialist, but good, hard-working, brilliant woman. Runs a marvellous service, but she couldn't handle dying, because what does an existentialist say to a dying child? This is absurd. I'm glad it's you, not me. I mean, that's not helpful, and she's a nice lady. She wouldn't do that. And the first child she sat with, of course, God was at work, was a little girl of 8 dying of leukemia, and just before she died, she sits up in bed and says, Mummy, can you hear the angels singing? It's beautiful. Can you see them? And she falls back dead. Now, the little professor was in trouble because she couldn't dismiss it. It's a happiness 4 story. And it took 3 of them to bring her back to faith. And if you sit with dying patients, you will see those things. There are all sorts of Christian witnesses to happiness 4 in medicine. You just need to tell them. Call them happiness 4 stories. Get them thinking about it. And, of course, you go on, you say, we have this dimension to our lives. Medicine knows about it. See, they recognize genuine stories, genuine case histories. They're not going to deny it. And you can go on. They'll come and ask questions after that. But whatever level you're stuck at is going to determine how you think about abortion and everything else. Abortion is a symptom, not a cause of our problems. And we've thought of it as the thing that we need to focus on. No, we need to think of it as a symptom of what we believe and correct the belief. Yeah. Please leave if you want to. I mean, I don't know.
One thing that helped keep me humble is remembering that we're all temporarily abled.
Yes.
And my question is, it seems to me the baby boom generation is most bought into, say, postmodern thought.
Yes.
And when it comes down to, what do you think is going to be more powerful? When they actually have to step up and, say, be euthanized, do you think that they will carry through with that? Or do you think, and I can imagine that there would be a backlash amongst the people that would actually have to do it, or will the inculcation of their thought in the next generation overpower that?
Well, the people who have to do it will probably be the ones who backlash. The people that it's done to will probably accept it. Look at Holland. And if you really want a beautiful description of this phenomenon, read Koestler's Darkness at Noon. We can rationalize ourselves to death. We're quite capable of it. Other cultures have done it. We might do it again. So the solution to the problem is that we should become salty and show a better way. Now, that's what happened in the first century. The first writing that I'm aware of by a non-Christian about Christians is a Roman governor writing to Rome, and he says this. He says, these Christians do not expose their own children. I mean, the whole of the pre-Christian world was brutal. Infanticide was the norm. Abortion wasn't available. But he said, these Christians don't do that. And moreover, they are rescuing the exposed children of others. There was a place at the city gate where you left the children and the dogs ate them. Why was he writing? Because he knew that a subset of society who loves children sacrificially will take over. I mean, is there any doubt that those children would be Christian when they learned why they were alive? None. And the Christians did take over. We'll do the same again. As the medical system becomes technically more competent and less compassionate, churches will become the places where people go. You see, we are now, medicine is being asked to fulfill a priestly function for which it's not trained. And we need to recognize that. Most of the patients you see now, well, let me put it in the form of a question to do it Socratically. Think back to when you started in medicine. What proportion of the patients you saw then could be adequately handled with a purely pathophysiological approach? Just shout out a number. 50. And how old are you? The older you get, the bigger the figure is, you see. If you get back as old as me, probably 70% of the patients I saw in internal medicine, being particularly insensitive, I thought were adequately coped with, and I did only pathophysiology. But if you work in an inner-city clinic now, what proportion of patients' problems are purely pathophysiological? Yeah, way down, you see. Because we are now suffering from diseases which are to a considerable degree induced by our own behavior, which means that guilt is part of them. Wendell Berry has a beautiful metaphor for this, which I use with students. Wendell Berry says, when you explain something in the modern sense, you find leftovers. Modern explanation is a bucket, not a well. And what he means is that if you lower the bucket of pathophysiology into the well of the patient's experience, in the past you pulled up most of it. Now you're pulling up less and less and less because their real problems are existential. And we have got to relearn how to do that. And we'll do it more explicitly and more effectively within the context of the church. The saline solution moves in that direction, but it's only the beginning. We have a long way to go with that. Read Wendell Berry's short story, Fidelity, if you want to have a beautifully poetic description of this phenomenon. There's one line in that story you need to think about. These people come to the intensive care unit, which as usual is more intensive than careful. And he says they came where their offerings could not be accepted. Now, the modern student doesn't realize what's involved in that metaphor. See, Wendell Berry recognizes that when we visit someone in hospital, particularly somebody who's there, say with AIDS or something due to smoking, they need priestly functions. We bring offerings. We help them with lamentation. We help them to deal with that process. And the intensivist doesn't know that he's meant to be a priest and doesn't know how to do the job. So they leave disappointed. Beautiful story, and I haven't spoiled the ending for you. Yeah, that was supposed to be the last question, but if you're loud, you can get one more in. Thank you for that question. That's why we run Augustine College. I don't think medicine can be understood from within the medical faculty. What is needed is an understanding of how we come to be who we are. And we are the products of Jewish and Greek thought modified by the Church, Catholic and Protestant. And when you understand that history, you understand who you are, and you begin to have some of the capacity to answer the questions that are at stake. We spent a year over that process. Send us your children. It's a bit late for you. You'll have to come for 1 week stretches. We had our first Augustine Docs conference last week. 24 physicians, 5 from Canada and 19 from the States. And I think we had a good week. 2 of you are here, I think, possibly. I can't see you at the moment, but It was really fun. We didn't have any lectures in the afternoon, for which they were grateful. They said it took all afternoon to recover from the morning, and then we did it again in the evening. But I don't think they had seen people who got carried away with their subject in quite the same way. Ed Blado was talking on Alcibiades, and one of them said to me afterwards, you know, I expected him to tell me what he had for breakfast. You know, he lived in the 5th century, you know, and he brought it to life for them. And the nature of what Protagoras taught Alcibiades actually led to the wreck of Rome. And what we have been teaching since the Enlightenment is leading to the wreck of the West. Technology is not self-supporting. It will die out. And science needs a deeper base. And so that's what we try and teach. And that it's got to be at that kind of level. A lot more reading. I would love to see every medical school with a humanities program where great literature is read, because they're beyond didactic teaching. It needs somebody at the level of a poet to get at their souls. You know, Walker Percy says that a poet, a novelist is somebody who says, I don't feel so good, what about you? And in the process draws you deeply in. You see, most Christian novels are trivial. They're preachy, they're moralistic. Great novels do things to you without you realizing. They draw you in. And the understanding is deep. And Christians ought to understand this, because some of our most important knowledge is what Polanyi calls tacit knowledge. When people say to you, you're an irrational Christian, say, no, you're not. What I inhabit is super-rational, not irrational. You all see people who go mad. What happens to people's lives when they go mad? They fall apart, don't they? When they become truly irrational, their lives fall apart. When somebody gets converted, does their life fall apart or fall together? It falls together, doesn't it? It's not irrational, it's super-rational. It's not less than my reductionist rationality, it's more. It encompasses it. It doesn't destroy it. Because what we know in part. 1 Corinthians 13. But that doesn't mean we don't know. In medicine, we know all sorts of things that we rationalize afterwards. If I came to your town and said, who's the best surgeon or who's the best internist, I'd get the same answer from most of the physicians in town. They'll say, why? Now you're in trouble. You know, quite certainly, but then you rationalize your knowledge afterwards. Conversion is the best example, and we don't tell truthful stories about conversion. So we train our children to tell stories that are not true. I mean, the propositional description of salvation is simply not true. It's not what happens, is it? What you have is a non-explanatory story.